August 15, 1945. Noon. Tokyo. The voice crackles through every radio in the empire, static-filled, hesitant, impossible. Emperor Hirohito speaks for the first time to his people, not as a god, but as a man bearing unbearable news. His words filter through wooden speakers in factory courtyards, through military barracks, through the shattered remains of homes that once stood proud. The broadcast is formal, distant, wrapped in the antiquated court language that most citizens struggle to pass. But three words pierce through the confusion like shrapnel. Endure the unendurable. Across the archipelago, millions stand frozen. Some weep, some rage, some simply stare at the sky, waiting for it to fall. In the scorched ruins of what was once the industrial heart of Yokohama, a young woman named Fumiko clutches her infant daughter and realizes with cold certainty that the world she was promised, the world of divine victory and endless sacrifice, has just dissolved like morning mist. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. And now, in the terrifying silence that follows 4 years of air raid sirens and propaganda anthems, a new fear takes root. What comes next? They had been told stories. For months, as American bombers turned their cities into ash gardens, and the noose of naval blockade tightened around their islands, the warnings intensified. Government pamphlets distributed to every household painted vivid nightmares. American soldiers as beasts, as demons who would rape, mutilate, torture. Radio broadcasts detailed invented atrocities. Women violated in the streets of Manila, children bayoneted in Saipan, prisoners flayed alive. The message was clear and repeated until it became doctrine. Surrender meant extinction. Better to die with honor, to throw yourself from a cliff, to detonate a grenade held against your own chest than to fall into American hands. On Okinawa, entire families had chosen that path. Parents drowning their children in the sea rather than face the enemy. Tens of thousands leapt from cliffs. The Americans called it Suicide Cliff, unable to comprehend the depth of terror their own propaganda and Japanese indoctrination had instilled. Now, with occupation imminent, that same terror gripped the mainland. Fumiko had heard the stories from her neighbor, whose brother-in-law claimed to have inside knowledge from the military police. American soldiers would seize all food supplies. They would burn what remained of Japanese homes. They would separate families, execute men of fighting age, enslave women. Survival, if it could be called that, would mean degradation beyond imagination. In the weeks following the surrender broadcast, an eerie paralysis settled over Japan's surviving population. Cities lay in ruins: Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. More than 60 urban centers reduced to landscapes of twisted metal and charcoal. The firebombing campaigns had been methodical, designed not just to destroy industrial capacity, but to break civilian morale, to demonstrate the futility of continued resistance. Hiroshima and Nagasaki stood as testament to a new age of warfare, their populations vaporized or dying slowly from radiation sickness that turned human bodies into open wounds. Food supplies had collapsed. The blockade meant no imports, and domestic production had been sacrificed years earlier to the war machine. Rice rations had shrunk to handfuls. People boiled weeds, ground acorns into paste, caught rats in the rubble. Malnutrition hollowed cheeks, swelled bellies, made every movement exhausting. Children no longer cried. They simply stared with enormous eyes from skeletal faces, too weak for tears. In this landscape of starvation and ruin, the population waited for the invaders. Some dug pits and covered them with bamboo mats, planning ambushes that would never come. Others hid what little they possessed: family heirlooms, photographs, anything that might be confiscated. Many simply sat in the rubble of their homes and waited to die, unable to imagine a future in this new world. The first American troops landed at Atsugi Air Base on August 28, 1945. General Douglas MacArthur would follow 2 days later, descending from his transport plane with theatrical flair, corncob pipe clenched between his teeth, stepping onto Japanese soil as conqueror and administrator. The occupation had begun. Initial landings were tense. Japanese officials had assured the Americans that surrender was total, but soldiers on both sides carried the weight of 4 years of brutal island warfare. The Pacific Campaign had been savage in ways that Europe never quite matched, a race war fought with mutual contempt and atrocity. Japanese soldiers had fought to the death on island after island, preferring suicide charges to capture. American forces had learned to take few prisoners, to clear caves with flamethrowers, to expect treachery even in defeat. Now these same forces faced not enemy soldiers but civilians, women, children, elderly, the wounded. In the ruins of Yokohama, where Fumiko huddled with her daughter in what remained of a neighborhood association building, the rumble of American vehicles could be heard before they were seen. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks rolling through streets barely wide enough to accommodate them, navigating around bomb craters and collapsed structures. The sound alone sparked panic. Families fled deeper into the ruins. Some women attempted to disguise themselves as men, cutting their hair, smearing their faces with ash. Fumiko pressed her daughter close and recited a Buddhist prayer her grandmother had taught her, words meant for the dying. But the American soldiers who dismounted from those vehicles were not the demons of propaganda. They were exhausted young men, most barely out of their teens, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, merchants' sons from California who happened to speak Japanese. They carried rifles, yes, but also something unexpected. Crates stamped with English letters that meant nothing to Japanese civilians watching from hiding places. The soldiers moved methodically, not with the fury of conquerors, but with the practiced efficiency of men following orders. They established checkpoints, posted sentries, began the process of securing the occupation zone. And then, in an act that would be repeated across Japan in the following days and weeks, they did something that shattered every expectation. They distributed food. Not as a reward, not in exchange for cooperation, but simply because people were starving. American supply lines, the same logistical miracle that had sustained island-hopping campaigns across the Pacific, now pivoted to feed a former enemy. Sea rations, canned goods, powdered milk, chocolate bars, crackers. Supplies that had sustained American forces now flowed to Japanese civilians. In Yokohama, in Tokyo, in Osaka and Nagasaki, and every ruined city, the pattern repeated. American soldiers set up distribution points, called out in halting Japanese for people to approach, handed out food to anyone who came forward. Fumiko watched from the shadows as an American soldier, red-haired, impossibly tall, his uniform clean in a way that seemed obscene amid such ruin, placed a crate on a makeshift table and began unpacking its contents. Cans with bright labels, packages wrapped in waxed paper, and bottles, clear glass bottles filled with water. Clean water, not the brackish liquid drawn from contaminated wells, not the muddy runoff collected in bomb craters, but water that caught the sunlight and looked pure. The soldier called out in broken Japanese, gesturing for people to come. No one moved. The paralysis of fear held them frozen. Minutes passed. The soldier waited patiently, occasionally taking a drink from one of the bottles himself, demonstrating its safety. Finally, driven by thirst that had become physical pain, an old man emerged from the ruins. He approached slowly, bent nearly double, hands raised to show he carried no weapon. The soldier smiled, actually smiled, and handed him a bottle of water. The old man stared at it as if it might explode. Then, with trembling hands, he unscrewed the cap and drank. His eyes widened. He drank again, longer, the water spilling down his chin. When he lowered the bottle, he was weeping. Other civilians began to emerge, hesitant at first, then in increasing numbers. Fumiko found herself moving forward, her daughter clutched to her chest, propelled by a thirst that overrode terror. The red-haired soldier handed her a bottle, said something in English she couldn't understand, then added in Japanese, so mangled she almost didn't recognize it. For baby, too. He smiled at her daughter, a genuine smile without threat, and handed her a second bottle. That water, clean, cold, offered freely by the enemy they had been taught to fear above all else, became a symbol that would echo through Japanese memory for generations. It was not just hydration, though in that moment of desperate need, the physical relief was overwhelming. It was the first crack in the wall of propaganda, the first whisper that perhaps the narrative they had been fed for 4 years might have been a lie. Fumiko stood in the rubble of her destroyed city, holding 2 bottles of American water, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. The Americans were not demons. They were not even particularly cruel. They were simply young men following orders, and those orders apparently included keeping conquered populations alive. This realization was almost more destabilizing than surrender itself. If the Americans were not monsters, then what did that make Japan's leaders, who had warned of monstrous enemies? If occupation meant food and water rather than rape and execution, then what had the war been for? What did it mean that her husband had died in the Philippines, fighting to prevent exactly this? Foreign occupation that turned out to involve bottled water and canned food, rather than the apocalypse they had been promised. The American occupation force numbered eventually over 350,000 troops, the largest peacetime deployment in U.S. history to that point. Their mission, as outlined by MacArthur and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was unprecedented. Not merely to control a defeated enemy, but to fundamentally remake Japanese society. Demilitarization, democratization, economic reconstruction, goals so ambitious they bordered on fantasy. But the first priority was basic survival. Japan, in August 1945, teetered on the edge of mass starvation. Agricultural production had collapsed. Transportation infrastructure lay in ruins. The fishing fleet, Japan's traditional protein source, had been destroyed by American submarines and air attacks. Expert estimates suggested that without immediate intervention, millions would die in the coming winter. The American response was massive food importation on a scale never before attempted. Ships that had carried supplies for invasion forces now carried wheat, rice, canned goods, powdered milk. The U.S. military government requisitioned supplies from American farms, purchased food from Australia and Southeast Asia, converted Japanese factories from military to food production. By November 1945, 800,000 tons of food per month flowed into Japan, enough to provide minimal rations to the entire civilian population. This was not charity in any conventional sense. Japan would eventually be required to pay for much of it. But in those first desperate months, it was simply given, distributed through local governments and neighborhood associations, monitored by American occupation authorities to prevent hoarding or black market diversion. For Japanese civilians experiencing this influx, the contrast with their own government's wartime policies was stark and impossible to ignore. The military regime that had ruled Japan since the early 1930s had demanded total sacrifice for the war effort. Civilians had been required to donate metal for weapons production. Pots, pans, even Buddhist temple bells melted down for munitions. Food had been rationed to near starvation levels, while the military consumed the best supplies. Air raid shelters had been inadequate, civilian casualties dismissed as necessary sacrifice. The government had prepared for a final battle on the home islands that would have required every citizen to become a weapon, to resist until death, with estimates of civilian casualties in the millions. Now, defeated and occupied, The population found themselves better fed than they had been in the final years of war. American supply lines proved more efficient than Japanese logistics had ever been. Distribution, though imperfect, reached even remote rural areas. The irony was inescapable. The enemy cared more for Japanese civilian survival than Japan's own leaders had. This realization spread through the population like a virus, infecting every conversation, undermining every remaining shred of faith in the ideology that had demanded so much sacrifice for so hollow a cause. The water itself, that clear bottled water handed out by American soldiers, became a tangible symbol of this ideological inversion. Japan had always prided itself on purity, on ritual cleanliness, on the spiritual significance of water in Shinto tradition. Yet by war's end, most civilians had no access to clean water. Wells had been contaminated by bombing, by bodies buried in rubble, by sewage from destroyed infrastructure. Waterborne disease, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, killed as surely as malnutrition. American engineering units tackled water purification as a primary mission, establishing filtration systems, chlorinating supplies, distributing bottled water while infrastructure was rebuilt. Japanese civilians watched American soldiers drinking casually from canteens, observed the casual abundance with which water was used, for washing vehicles, for showers, for purposes that seemed almost wasteful in their extravagance, and understood that they were witnessing a different civilization, one where basic resources were so plentiful that scarcity itself seemed alien. The contrast struck at the heart of Japanese wartime ideology, which had valorized scarcity, sacrifice, making do with less. The military had praised the Japanese soldiers' ability to survive on a handful of rice, while American troops required elaborate supply chains. This had been presented as spiritual superiority, as proof of Japanese virtue versus American softness. But now, in defeat, that virtue looked like simple poverty, and American softness looked like industrial capacity beyond imagination. Private First Class James Morrison from Nebraska, barely 19 years old, wrote to his parents in September 1945, describing his experience distributing supplies in the ruins of Tokyo. "They look at us like we're from another planet. Yesterday I gave a little boy a Hershey bar and he just held it, didn't know what to do with it. His mother showed him how to unwrap it, and when he tasted chocolate for the first time, his face lit up like Christmas morning. These people have nothing. I mean nothing. They live in holes in the ground, in shacks made from sheet metal and boards. Kids with no shoes, skinny as rails. And they're scared of us, you can see it. But they're also starving, so they come anyway. We hand out rations and they bow, over and over, thanking us for food that back home we'd feed to hogs. It makes you think. We spent 4 years killing each other, and now I'm giving candy to their kids. War's a funny thing." Morrison's letters, preserved in the Nebraska State Historical Society, capture the confusion many young American soldiers felt, trained to view the Japanese as fanatical enemies, now confronted with the human reality of defeated civilians who looked more pitiable than threatening. This cognitive dissonance worked both ways. Japanese civilians had been taught that Americans were barbaric, racially inferior, motivated only by material greed. Yet the occupiers behaved, for the most part, with discipline and even kindness. They followed rules, distributed supplies fairly, refrained from the looting and rape that had characterized Japanese occupations in China and Southeast Asia. There were incidents, certainly. No occupation involving hundreds of thousands of young men is without violence and abuse. But the systematic atrocities that propaganda had promised never materialized. Instead, there were chocolates for children, water for the thirsty, medicine for the sick. The Japanese government, now stripped of military control and operating under American oversight, struggled to process this new reality. Officials who had months earlier been planning civilian suicide attacks now found themselves coordinating with occupation authorities to distribute American relief supplies. The bureaucratic machinery that had mobilized total war now pivoted to managing total defeat. And in that pivot, many discovered that American administrators were more interested in efficiency than revenge. MacArthur's headquarters operated with the assumption that a stable, functioning Japan served American interests better than a chaotic, resentful one. This meant working through existing Japanese institutions where possible, maintaining social order, preventing the kind of collapse that would require even more intensive occupation. Food distribution became a joint operation. American supplies managed through Japanese neighborhood associations, with local officials accountable to American supervisors, but retaining administrative authority. This pragmatic approach meant that for most Japanese civilians, their first extended contact with Americans came not through direct military control, but through the medium of food and water, the most basic human needs met by the former enemy in ways their own government had failed to manage. Fumiko returned to the distribution point every 3 days, whenever new supplies arrived. Each time felt slightly less terrifying, slightly more routine. She began to recognize individual soldiers, the red-haired one who always smiled, another who spoke surprisingly good Japanese, and explained he'd been a missionary's son in Osaka before the war. She noticed details that contradicted everything she'd been told. How young they were, how some looked as tired and homesick as Japanese soldiers had looked in the final months. She observed their equipment, the staggering abundance of it, vehicles that ran smoothly, uniforms that fit properly, rations that came in seemingly endless supply. Most striking was their health. They had meat in their rations. Meat, not just rice and vegetables, but actual beef, pork, chicken. She watched one soldier casually discard half an uneaten sandwich, tossing it to a group of Japanese children who fell on it like starving dogs. The waste was obscene, and yet also revealing. These people had so much that they could afford to throw food away. What kind of nation possessed such abundance that its soldiers treated food as disposable? What industrial power could sustain supply lines across the Pacific Ocean to feed not just its own troops, but also millions of defeated enemies? The answer lay in the fundamental economic asymmetry that had doomed Japan's war effort from the beginning. American industrial production in 1945 exceeded that of Germany, Japan, Italy, and the Soviet Union combined. The United States had entered the war with the world's largest economy, and emerged from it with that economy expanded, modernized, operating at full capacity. American factories had produced 300,000 aircraft during the war, 88,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, and enough ammunition to supply both the Pacific and European theaters simultaneously. Japanese production, by contrast, had peaked in 1942 and declined steadily thereafter as raw materials became scarce and bombing disrupted factories. The Japanese military had gone to war believing that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage, that samurai spirit would defeat American industrial might. They had been catastrophically wrong. Now, in defeat, that material reality became inescapable. Every can of American food, every bottle of clean water, every bar of soap distributed to Japanese civilians was a tangible demonstration of the wealth gap that had made the war's outcome inevitable from the start. Japanese military planners had known this intellectually. They had studied American production statistics, understood the resource imbalance. But they had gambled that a quick knockout blow at Pearl Harbor, followed by a defensive perimeter, would lead to negotiated peace before American industrial capacity could be fully mobilized. That gamble had failed, and now the population paid the price in occupation and humiliation. Yet as weeks turned to months, and the feared atrocities never materialized, humiliation began to mix with something more complex. A grudging recognition that occupation might offer opportunities that militarist nationalism had denied. American authorities began implementing reforms that Japanese progressives had advocated for decades before the military seized power. Women received the right to vote in December 1945, a reform that Japan's own government had blocked for generations. Labor unions were legalized, allowed to organize for the first time since the 1920s. Land reform broke up the quasi-feudal agricultural system, redistributing land to tenant farmers. Education was restructured, with American advisors pushing for democratic curriculum to replace militarist indoctrination. The new Constitution, drafted largely by American lawyers in MacArthur's headquarters, but presented as Japanese initiative, enshrined civil liberties that had been systematically suppressed. Article 9 renounced war as a sovereign right, transforming Japan from militarist empire to pacifist state overnight. These reforms were imposed by force of occupation, but many found ready support among Japanese citizens exhausted by war and disillusioned with the ideology that had led to catastrophe. The water handed out by American soldiers became a symbol not just of physical survival, but of a different social order, one where authority served the population rather than demanding endless sacrifice from it. Fumiko's daughter grew healthier on American rations. The hollow look left her face, replaced by the round-cheeked fullness of a properly fed child. Fumiko herself gained weight, felt energy return, began to imagine a future beyond mere survival. She started attending English classes organized by the occupation authorities, sitting in a makeshift classroom in what had been a factory, learning basic phrases from an American teacher who seemed genuinely interested in helping them rebuild their lives. Other women attended as well, widows mostly, women whose husbands had died in the war and who now needed to navigate a world where English was the language of power. The classes were practical: how to read ration tickets, how to communicate with occupation authorities, how to find work in the new economy emerging from the ruins. But they were also ideological. The American teachers spoke of democracy, of individual rights, of the value of human life over abstract national glory. These concepts had been taught in Japan before the military takeover, but they had been suppressed for so long that they felt almost foreign. Now, delivered in halting English by young American women who seemed impossibly confident and independent, they began to take root again. Fumiko found herself thinking dangerous thoughts, that perhaps her husband's death had been meaningless, that the war had been a mistake from the beginning, that the future might be found not in restoring the past but in embracing something entirely new. By the spring of 1946, the immediate crisis had passed. Mass starvation had been averted through American food imports. Basic infrastructure was being rebuilt. The black market, which had flourished in the chaos of defeat, was being suppressed through occupation police action and the restoration of legal distribution channels. Tokyo and other cities remained ruins, but amid the rubble, life reasserted itself. Markets reopened, schools resumed. Children played in the streets, and their laughter, absent for so long, became the most powerful symbol of recovery. The American presence had become routine, soldiers a familiar sight, rather than objects of terror. Interactions normalized. Japanese vendors sold goods to American soldiers, who proved eager customers for local crafts and souvenirs. Friendships formed across the linguistic and cultural divide, sometimes blossoming into romance, creating a generation of Japanese war brides who would emigrate to America. The rigid racial hierarchy that Japanese propaganda had insisted defined American society proved more complex in practice. African American soldiers, segregated in their own units and often assigned to labor and supply duties, interacted with Japanese civilians who found them less intimidating than white soldiers, perhaps because shared experiences of discrimination created unexpected common ground. The occupation was not utopian. There were tensions, resentments, crimes, and abuses. But it was also not the apocalypse that had been promised, and in that gap between expectation and reality, a new Japan began to emerge. The water itself continued to flow. American engineering units rebuilt treatment plants, restored pipes, chlorinated supplies. By 1947, Tokyo's water system functioned better than it had at any point during the war. The occupation authority made public health infrastructure a priority, understanding that epidemic disease threatened not just Japanese civilians, but also American troops. Cholera and typhoid outbreaks were aggressively contained through vaccination campaigns and sanitation improvements. The result was a dramatic decrease in waterborne illness, a measurable improvement in public health that even skeptics of occupation couldn't deny. Clean water stopped being a luxury distributed by foreign soldiers and became once again a normal part of daily life. Yet the memory of those first bottles, handed out in the ruins by red-haired soldiers who smiled instead of executing, remained vivid. For a generation of Japanese who lived through the surrender, water carried symbolic weight beyond its physical properties. It represented the moment when reality diverged from propaganda, when the enemy proved less monstrous than their own leaders had claimed, when survival became possible, not through sacrifice and endurance, but through the mundane generosity of conquerors who brought supplies instead of swords. Historical records from the occupation period reveal the strategic thinking behind American generosity. Documents from MacArthur's headquarters make clear that humanitarian concerns were genuine, but also served calculated political purposes. A starving, resentful population would be difficult to govern, vulnerable to communist agitation, and potentially require indefinite military occupation. A population that associated America with food, medicine, and reconstruction would be more tractable, more willing to accept democratic reforms, and more likely to become a stable ally in the emerging Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union. Japan's occupation, in this sense, was designed to serve as a demonstration project, proof that American power could be benevolent, that democracy could be exported, that former enemies could be transformed into friends. The investment was enormous, billions of dollars in aid, years of occupation, the commitment of hundreds of thousands of troops. But from Washington's perspective, the alternative, a hostile Japan vulnerable to Soviet influence, was unacceptable. So the water flowed, the food was distributed, and the reconstruction proceeded, all underwritten by American taxpayers who were told they were preventing the next war by winning the peace. Whether ordinary Americans understood the strategic calculation behind aid to former enemies is debatable, but the policy had sufficient political support to continue for the duration of occupation, which would last until 1952. Fumiko's story, though individual, reflected patterns repeated millions of times across Japan. The woman who had prepared to die rather than face occupation instead found herself learning English, working as a translator for occupation authorities, eventually remarrying, not to an American, but to a Japanese teacher who shared her cautious optimism about the new order. Her daughter would grow up in a Japan so transformed as to be almost unrecognizable from the militarist empire that had gone to war. You will be allowed to live, to rebuild, to find a place in the post-war order. The message came not through words, but through the simple act of offering hydration to the thirsty, food to the hungry, medicine to the sick. Such gestures can be strategic, can serve calculated political ends, and still be genuinely humane. The American soldiers distributing supplies were not saints, they were following orders, executing a policy designed in Washington and Tokyo by strategists thinking about Cold War alliances and democratic transformations. But they were also young men capable of empathy, who saw suffering and tried to alleviate it, who smiled at children and comforted frightened mothers, because that's what decent people do, even in the midst of occupation. The Japanese civilians receiving those supplies were not passive victims. They were survivors, making calculated decisions about how to navigate defeat, weighing risks, overcoming indoctrinated fears to accept help from the enemy. The interaction was complex, layered with power dynamics and historical grievances and immediate needs, but at its core was a simple human exchange. I am thirsty. Here is water. Thank you. Historians debate the occupation's legacy, arguing about whether reforms were genuinely democratic or merely American imperialism in progressive clothing. Whether economic recovery was due to occupation policies or Japanese resilience and ingenuity. Whether the security alliance represents partnership or continued subordination. These debates are important, but they can obscure the lived experience of ordinary people, navigating extraordinary circumstances. For Fumiko and millions like her, the abstract questions about imperialism and democracy mattered less than the concrete reality. Her daughter survived. She survived. They had food and water and eventually shelter. They rebuilt their lives in a society that, whatever its flaws, was not the apocalyptic nightmare they had been prepared for. The war had taken her husband, destroyed her city, and shattered the ideological certainties she'd been raised with. The occupation gave her a bottle of water and with it, permission to imagine a different future. That trade-off, loss and grief and humiliation in exchange for survival and possibility, was not fair or just in any cosmic sense, but it was the deal history offered, and she took it, because the alternative was death or despair. The symbolic power of water in this narrative extends beyond Japan. Throughout history, water has represented purification, renewal, the basic stuff of life itself. In religious traditions, from baptism to ablution, water marks transitions and transformations. In the mundane present, access to clean water remains one of the sharpest dividing lines between development and poverty, security and crisis. The American soldiers offering bottled water in the ruins of Japan were not thinking in terms of symbolism. They were following orders to prevent disease and starvation. But the recipients received those bottles in a moment of maximum vulnerability and fear, and so the water became freighted with meaning beyond hydration. It was evidence that challenged propaganda, a tangible demonstration that the world might be different than they'd been told, a reason to hope that survival might be possible. In that specific historical moment, American abundance, the casual, wasteful, overwhelming abundance that could supply clean water to millions of defeated enemies, represented not just material wealth, but a different social contract, one where the state's purpose was to enable flourishing rather than demand sacrifice. This contrast with Japan's wartime ideology, which had glorified scarcity and suffering as virtuous, made the water a revolutionary symbol, a quiet argument for a different way of organizing society. Decades later, as Japan prospered and memories of war faded into history, the image of that first water offered by American soldiers remained present in national consciousness, kept alive through memoirs, documentaries, and family stories. It became a touchstone for understanding the occupation period, a way to explain to younger generations how Japan had transformed so rapidly from militant empire to pacifist democracy, from America's enemy to its ally. The story was often sanitized, romanticized, stripped of its ambiguities and contradictions. The American occupation became, in popular memory, almost entirely benevolent. MacArthur, a wise father figure guiding Japan to democracy. This mythologization served political purposes, reinforcing the US-Japan alliance during the Cold War and beyond. But underneath the myth, the core truth remained. In the moment of Japan's greatest vulnerability, the expected atrocities didn't materialize, and instead there was water, food, medicine, and eventually a path forward. That truth, however politically instrumentalized, was powerful because it was grounded in millions of individual experiences, ordinary moments of human decency amid the wreckage of war. The ocean that had been a battlefield, where submarines hunted merchant ships, where kamikaze pilots crashed into carriers, where the largest naval conflicts in history had consumed thousands of lives, became instead a highway for supply ships bringing food to feed a former enemy. The same logistical capacity that had enabled island-hopping campaigns now sustained occupation and reconstruction. American naval supremacy, which had strangled Japan through blockade, now kept sea lanes open for the shipments of wheat and rice and canned goods that prevented mass starvation. This transformation from instrument of war to tool of peace happened with remarkable speed, a pivot that demonstrated both American military efficiency and the political commitment to making occupation work. The Pacific, which had seemed to both sides like an impassable barrier, necessitating brutal battles for every island, became instead a connection, a link between two nations learning, however awkwardly, to coexist. Japanese ports that had launched invasions now received aid shipments. Docks that had loaded troops and munitions now unloaded food and medicine. The water that surrounded Japan, which had been both protection and prison, became the medium through which transformation arrived, carried in the holds of American ships. In the end, the question of who first offered water to Japanese civilians after surrender has a simple answer. American soldiers, following orders from an occupation authority that understood keeping the population alive was prerequisite to every other goal. But the deeper significance of that question, why it matters, what it reveals, extends far beyond a factual answer. It matters because it captures the moment when ideology confronted reality, and reality won. Japanese civilians had been told they were fighting a race war against barbaric Americans who would show no mercy. American troops had been told they were fighting fanatical enemies, incapable of reason or surrender. Both populations had been fed propaganda that dehumanized the other. The moment when an American soldier handed water to a Japanese mother, and she accepted it and drank, was a moment when propaganda dissolved in the face of basic human needs and basic human decency. Neither side was saintly. Both nations had committed atrocities during the war. Both would continue to act in their own interests during occupation. But in that moment, the transactional exchange of water for thirst became something more, an acknowledgement of shared humanity, a first step toward the possibility that former enemies might find ways to coexist, even to cooperate, even eventually to build something together from the ruins of what they'd destroyed. The water flows still. Modern Japan, with its gleaming cities and efficient infrastructure, has clean water in abundance. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those who accepted bottles from American soldiers drink from taps without thinking about the history those taps represent, without remembering a time when clean water was scarce and precious. This is as it should be. Nations heal, memories fade. The urgent crises of one generation become the historical footnotes of the next. But there is value in remembering, in tracing the path from surrender to reconstruction, from occupied territory to sovereign nation, from enemy to ally. That path was not inevitable. Different choices by leaders on both sides could have produced different outcomes: a vindictive occupation that bred lasting resentment, a rejection of reforms that preserved militarist power structures, a Cold War alignment with the Soviet Union rather than America. The history that actually unfolded was shaped by countless decisions, large and small, strategic and personal, deliberate and accidental. Among those decisions was the choice to distribute water to the thirsty, food to the hungry, to treat defeated enemies as human beings worthy of basic care, rather than as conquered peoples to be exploited or annihilated. That choice, however strategically motivated, was also profoundly humane, and it set in motion transformations that neither side fully anticipated or controlled. So we returned to Fumiko in the ruins of Yokohama, accepting a bottle of water from a red-haired soldier, feeling the cool glass in her hands, unscrewing the cap with trembling fingers, drinking deeply and tasting purity she'd almost forgotten existed. Her daughter watches, enormous eyes in a skeletal face, and the soldier hands the child a second bottle, speaks incomprehensible English words in a gentle tone, smiles without threat. Fumiko bows, habit, instinct, the ingrained courtesy that occupation cannot immediately erase, and the soldier nods back, a gesture of acknowledgement. No words pass between them. Their languages are mutually incomprehensible, their cultures separated by vast differences in values and assumptions, their nations locked in the aftermath of a savage war. But in the exchange of water, something is communicated that transcends all barriers. We will not kill you. You will be allowed to live. There is a future beyond this moment of defeat. That message, carried in a bottle, offered by an enemy who turned out not to be monstrous after all, would resonate through generations, shaping a nation's memory and trajectory. The water was just water, hydrogen and oxygen molecules, purified and bottled, distributed according to military logistics plans. But water has always been more than its chemical composition. It is life. It is renewal. It is, sometimes, against all expectation, the first gift offered across the chasm of war, the first word of a new language, the first sign that tomorrow might be survivable after all.